Jesus Never Existed by Kenneth Humphreys, audiobook version. Chapter 3, The Syncretic Heritage of Christianity. Chapter 3, Prologue. Forget the fairy story. Many currents fed the Jesus myth, like streams and tributaries joining to form a major river. Christianity is the ultimate product of religious syncretism in the ancient world. As Christianity cut its way through the centuries, it became a very murky and dangerous torrent, sweeping away civilizations and all who stood in its way. Conjuring up Catholicism, religious fusion in Egypt. Welcome to Alexandria, the light of science and the cooking pot of religion, the religion of the pharaohs recast in Christian form. Regurgitated fables, reused symbols, recycled sacred space. That's show business. Silk and spice, the Buddhist influence in Christian origins. Opportunity, motive, method, and scripture itself provide evidence of a profound and detailed Buddhist influence in Christianity's origins. Dress rehearsal for Christianity, Mithraism. The first quote-unquote universal religion of the Greco-Roman world anticipated Christianity in almost all major respects. The Church of the Shadows, waiting in the wings. Many rival factions made up early Christianity. Austere fanatics on the one hand, scheming and ambitious clerics on the other. The patronage of a lucky prince brought the faith to center stage. Chapter 3, first section. Conjuring up Catholicism. Religious fusion in Egypt. At first glance, the Egyptian pantheon presents a bewildering array of gods having little in common with the Christian God-man, but properly understood, many Egyptian deities were city or regional variations on a theme. Gods whose fortunes rose or fell with the outcome of human power struggles and dynastic change. Triumphant priests merged useful aspects of a fallen rival's deity with their own favored god. This process of absorption, assimilation, and adaptation continued throughout the Greek, Roman, and Christian eras. The Greeks create a universal god. Following the breakup of Alexander's empire, his general, Ptolemy, took possession of Egypt, Palestine, and Cyprus, 323 to 282 BC. Alexandria, his capital, built on a spit of land unaffected by Nile floods between Lake Mareotis and the Mediterranean, looked back towards the Greek world and traded the wealth of Egypt. The great port became the hub of trade between Europe, Asia, India, and beyond. Settlers arrived from more ancient Greek cities, bringing Hellenic culture with them. Ptolemy himself encouraged artists and scholars of all nations to continue their work in his cosmopolitan city. With royal patronage, Alexandria became the intellectual capital of the ancient world. But the Greeks, far from Hellenizing the ancient land, to a great extent were themselves Egyptianized. A new syncretic culture emerged. Along with trade goods into Alexandria flowed every philosophy and creed known to man. In this most cosmopolitan of cities, religions mingled and mixed and borrowed freely from the ancient faith of Egypt itself. Alexandrian beliefs were nothing if not eclectic. Accessible to us even today, the catacombs of Alexandria most graphically illustrate the cultural fusion of the Roman era. Greek sarcophagi guarded by Egyptian gods in Roman military uniform. The Greek king Ptolemy styled himself Pharaoh and took the title Soter, or Saviour. Astute and worldly, he understood the political value of an official religion. A single composite deity, one God, one all-embracing system of belief might unify the diverse, often antagonistic peoples of his polyglot empire and strengthen their devotion to the god's earthly representative, himself. Such a god, to enjoy universal acceptance and devotion, would necessarily possess all the powers and aspects of earlier ones. To create that grand synthesis, in a process that anticipated the actions of the Roman Emperor Constantine several centuries later, Ptolemy put all the resources of the state behind the promotion and sponsorship of an official cult. Major temples of the god were built at Alexandria and Memphis. The Serapeum in Alexandria itself blended Egyptian gigantism with the grace and beauty of Hellenic style. The Serapeum grew into a vast complex, one of the grandest monuments of pagan civilization. Serapis. The name of the new god was Serapis, a transliteration via Zaparis of Asar-Hapi from the linked ancient Egyptian deities Osiris, king of the underworld, and Apis, the god of Memphis, where the local trinity was Ta, Sokar, Osiris. Osiris had begun his long career during the 5th dynasty, 2465 BC to 2323, as a god of agriculture. In contrast, the cult of Apis centered on the bull. A living animal, an incarnation of the god, was chosen for the distinctive marks on its body. It was considered to have been born of a virgin cow impregnated by the local creator god Ptah. The Greeks assimilated Osiris and Apis to gods of their own, Hades, god of the underworld, and Dionysus, god of agriculture and wine. Over the course of 500 years, most notably in Alexandria, the character of these several older gods were fused into the state-endorsed Serapis, effectively establishing the practice of virtual monotheism with a Trinitarian twist. Across the Ptolemaic Empire, which included the coast of Asia Minor and the Aegean, Serapis was identified with pre-existing deities and honored by more than 200 localized names. Serapis thus became a popular embodiment of the ancient Egyptian trinity and even a Greco-Egyptian version of the Greek Zeus. According to correspondence of Emperor Hadrian in Alexandria, one such name for Serapis was Christ. The cult of Serapis was both extensive and enduring. It outlived all other pharaonic and Greek gods, thrived well into the Roman period, and was exported to many parts of the empire. Jewel in the crown. Dynastic weakness and the death of Ptolemy IV in 203 encouraged Syrian Greek designs on the ailing Ptolemaic Empire. Between 201 and 197, the Seleucid king Antiochus III overran first the coast of Asia Minor, and then Palestine, where the Jewish Maccabees would successfully rebel some 30 years later. At this point, Rome, having finally defeated Carthage in 202, itself perceived the resurgent Seleucids as a threat in the east. With Egypt already bequeathed to the city by a bankrupt pharaoh, Ptolemy X Alexander, from 107 to 88, the Romans became increasingly involved in Egyptian affairs. This interest culminated in Roman annexation of Egypt in 30 BC. For the Caesars, Egypt was a lavish prize, immense accumulated wealth, and a source of exotic wonder. The treasury of the Ptolemies became the basis of Augustus's personal fortune. As food resources, the Nile Valley and the Fayum Oasis were amazingly fertile. A 10% grain levy was sufficient to feed Rome for 4 months of the year. Yet the conquest was not without potential danger. The ancient land could be defended with relative ease, and its strategic control of much of Rome's grain supply made the province an ideal base from which to mount a bid for the throne. In anticipation of such dangers, Augustus placed Egypt directly under his personal authority, with local control entrusted to a Roman prefect drawn from the equestrian rather than the senatorial class. Indeed, no senator could step foot in the province without the emperor's express approval. Administration of the province remained largely in the hands of Greek civil servants. Crisis for the priesthood. Quote, "The Egyptians reasoned that if it was the fate of the god Osiris to be resurrected after death, then a way could be found to make it the fate of man too. The bliss of immortality that had formerly been reserved only for kings was then promised to all men." Unquote. Lewis Brown, This Believing World, page 84. With the transfer of power from Greeks to Romans, the cycle of life appeared unchanging, but beneath the surface boiled a complex brew. Unlike the forested lands of Gaul and Germany, in Egypt were cities that predated the foundation of Rome by millennia. Cities dominated not by arenas and amphitheaters, but by the temples of exotic animal-headed deities. The Romans were a pious people, but in Egypt they faced religion on an epic scale. A rich and powerful caste of priests, unlike anything known in Rome, still wove a spell from the vast array of fortress-like temples. Historically, they had always been close to regal power. Priestcraft and the whole paraphernalia of temple commerce thrived, and the land was awash with religious iconography. Yet with the passing of the last of the Ptolemies, the priesthood had lost its god-king. The arrival of the Romans meant that the semi-divine pharaoh had been supplanted by a foreign general, and the whole country reduced to the personal fiefdom of an absentee landlord called Caesar. Headless and in reaction, indeed in resistance to Romanization, traditional religious interpretations had to be thought anew. The priests, who had exploited the sentiments of a deeply religious peasantry for thousands of years, were forced into a religious revisionism to find a new godhead for their ancient, quote, theology. They became susceptible to ideas percolating from the mouths of Hellenized Jews in Alexandria and the speculations of Greeks who went in awe of their ancient ceremonial and fabulous mythology. of volatile brew. Demographically, the province of Egypt was divided between a sophisticated and urban foreign element, mainly Greek and Jew, and the stubborn and superstitious native Egyptians. Within the many cities, and especially within Alexandria itself, cultural and commercial rivalry often brought the Greeks and Jews into conflict. Feuds, riots, and massacres were not infrequent. With Rome's annexation of Egypt, the Greeks lost their position as the country's ruling elite. Now bureaucrats but not rulers, increasingly they adopted the mores of native Egyptians. Thus, for example, between the 1st and 4th centuries A.D., the Egyptian Greeks, who traditionally had believed in immortality only of the soul, abandoned cremation and adopted Egyptian mummification, in the optimistic belief of a resurrection of the body, a notion that fed into early Christianity. From the 2nd century onward, Greek settlers were allowed to marry Egyptian natives, hitherto forbidden. In the main, the Egyptians were an underclass of rural laborers, alienated from their quote-unquote foreign landlords who occupied the cities. With the arrival of the Romans, the Greek peasantry were taxed even more than they had been by the Greeks, but with limited Roman development of the province, the natives gained little. Into the heady mix went the Jews, for centuries a volatile minority. The Jewish community had existed in this great metropolis for centuries and made up a third of the population of the city. Infused by emigres after the fall of the temple in 70, the whole Jewish community had been decimated following the rebellion of 115 to 117, but then a new wave of Jewish migrants and slaves arrived in Egypt after the war in Palestine of 135. Among all these displaced and disoriented races of Roman Egypt moved the agents of diverse cults and quote-unquote mystery religions, competing for membership and stealing each other's ideas. Roman governance had sent traditional religion into crisis, and the social stresses engendered by annexation found its reflection in the proliferation of radical theologies. The most successful cult of all, the supreme example of syncretism, was Christianity. Jewish revisionism. In the cities of the diaspora, the Jews had encountered local cults, traditions of philosophy, and secular knowledge. In each city, practicalities obliged the Jews, though by tradition an exclusive people, to work out an accommodation with local beliefs and custom. In Alexandria, the flow of thought certainly had been two-way. During the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, the son of Ptolemy, Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, intellectually curious of the Hebrew legends, commissioned Jewish scribes to translate their ancient scripture into the Greek language, the so-called Septuagint, LXX. In so doing, the Jews inadvertently made their stock of fables and oracles available for reworking by proto-Christians. The legends of both Adam and Moses were to provide, quote, biographical detail for the earthly career of Christ, finding safety in Egypt as a baby, perfect man, judge, teacher, etc. The inclusive culture of Greece and Rome allowed the Jews to become, often prosperous, citizens of their adopted polis without an insistence upon assimilation. But both admiration for the triumphs of Hellenism and frequent conflict with the Greeks, who were more favored by the Romans, inevitably meant Jewish acceptance of certain Hellenistic ideas, including the Greek language. Philo of Alexandria, circa 20 BC to 50 AD, Jewish historian and philosopher, even devised a quote-unquote Jewish Platonism, in which the Pentateuch was explained as elaborate allegory. Thus the Exodus symbolized the soul's flight from material existence. The laws of the Torah were held to correspond to primary Greek virtues, and God, it seems, was apprehensible to himself alone, and a source only of good. Utterly removed from the world of matter, his transcendence was communicated by a series of emanations, the most important of which was the Logos, later taken captive by Christian theorists. Philo cast his influence not only upon the Christian Platonists of Alexandria, Clement, and Origen, but also upon the Gnostic schools which thrived in the city early in the 2nd century. It is interesting to note that Philo's nephew, Tiberius Julius Alexander, rejected Judaism in toto and became Roman prefect of Judea, and later prefect of Egypt itself. It was none other than Tiberius Alexander who, in 47 AD, captured the Jewish rebels James and Simon, sons of Judas the Galilean, and had them crucified. Hotspots of religious radicalism. Under the Ptolemies, religious speculation flourished alongside schools of philosophy and science. In the Roman period, several Egyptian centers were important in the emergence of Christianity, and one of the most significant, Jewish notions of a Messiah, merged with pagan sun worship. On the shore of Lake Mareotis, close to Alexandria, a proto-Christian sect of Jewish radicals called the Therapeutae developed a libertarian blend of Judaism and the fertility cult of Isis. In this mixed-sex community, love, carnal as well as spiritual, was a key element. Philo, our sole source for information on the Therapeutae, says this, quote, "Then when each choir has separately done its own part in the feast, having drunk as in the Bacchic rites of the strong wine of God's love, they mix and both together become a single choir, a copy of the choir set up of old beside the Red Sea in honor of the wonders there wrought. Thus they continue till dawn, drunk with this drunkenness, in which there is no shame, then not with heavy heads or drowsy eyes, but more alert and wakeful than when they came to the banquet. They stand with their faces and whole body turned towards the east, and when they see the sun rising, they stretch their hands up to heaven and pray for bright days and knowledge of the truth and the power of keen-sighted thinking." End quote. Philo, De Vita Contemplativa, 83 to 89. Castigated alike by Greek intellectuals and prudish fellow Jews, the Therapeutae sought the divine in orgiastic ritual. Scandalous they may have been, but Philo reports their objective as, quote, wisdom, adding that the sect, usually described today as strict ascetics, had written its own books and psalms. Other cult centers. Ptolemy Soter had founded only one Greek, quote, new town in the interior, Ptolemais, a city honoring the Ptolemies themselves, and intended to supplant Thebes as the capital of Thebais. Ptolemais retained its importance as a landing place for the corn of Middle Egypt, but Roman annexation of Egypt put the cult center into crisis. In this area, Christian monasticism first appeared, perhaps instituted by quote-unquote Paul of Thebes in the 3rd century. Another cult center in Middle Egypt was Oxyrhynchus, a large and sophisticated town, the 3rd city of Egypt, which controlled access to the western oases and was an important fishing port. It took its name from the quote-unquote sharp-nosed fish, the sturgeon, which the city held sacred. According to legend, this fish ate the phallus of Osiris when the god's body was cut into pieces by his brother Seth. Isis, in the form of, quote, Abtu, a great fish of the abyss, unquote, was identified with the penis swallower. The fish cult spread to many parts of Egypt. The pagan city had about 20 temples, but by the 4th century, Oxyrhynchus had become a hotbed of Christianity. The heresy of Meloteios, bishop of Lycopolis, arose here. The writer Rufinus reported 12 churches as of the early 5th century, and added that the local bishop told him of, quote, the presence of 10,000 monks and 20,000 nuns, unquote. A papyrus dated from 535 gives a figure of some 40 churches for the city. The early medieval Arabic epic Kitab Futa al-Banasa al-Gara, or the Conquest of Banasa the Blessed, by Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Muiz, recounts the notion from Matthew's Gospel that the Holy Family had fled to Egypt and claimed that they had stayed at Oxyrhynchus. Many papyri dating from the 3rd to the 8th centuries were discovered in the town's rubbish mounds between 1896 and 1906. Along with classics from Greek literature were fragments of Christian texts, including a collection of logia, or sayings of Christ, which do not appear in the Gospels. The only Roman new town in Egypt was Antinopolis. Emperor Hadrian, a deeply pious man, interpreted the drowning of his lover in religious terms. According to Egyptian tradition, the death in the Nile had been a, quote, saving sacrifice, ensuring the continued well-being of Hadrian himself. To give Antinopolis a viable economy, Hadrian built roads across the desert linking the town with the Red Sea trade routes. In the 130s AD, the worship of Antinous became a state-sponsored cult throughout the empire. Though essentially the whole city was a shrine to another god, by the 3rd century, Antinopolis actually had 2 rival Christian bishops. The iconography of Antinous clearly influenced Christian art. The cult itself was folded into a more determined Christianity in the 4th century. Early Christians established also themselves in Carrara, or Fort Babylon of Byzantine times, north of Memphis. This ancient capital of Egypt, founded around 3100 BC, had been in decline from the time of the Greek conquest and the foundation of the city of Alexandria. Its preeminence had rested on control of the land and water traffic between Upper Egypt and the Delta, much of which passed to the new capital. Though the city remained important, in the Roman period the traditional priesthood were under serious pressure to restore their fortunes. Stirring the mixture. During the crucial decades of the 1st century and early 2nd centuries AD, Multifarious creeds competed and blended with each other. Good stories and entertaining pageants passed back and forth. The dissemination of Jewish scripture in the Greek language, the widespread availability of Greek classics, and a literate and motivated class of scribes meant new scripture began to join the old. The better to promote their own particular creed, clerics illustrated their unique insights with allegorical stories. The golden age of gospel writing had begun. All the cults had a hero, and the mythology surrounding the central Jesus/Christ/hero figure grew with time. Second section. Silk and Spice, the Buddhist Influence in Christian Origins. Speculation of a link between Christianity and Buddhism first arose as a result of the translation of Buddhist texts into European languages during the British colonization of India. Similarities in the stories of the births and lives of Jesus and Buddha were immediately apparent to scholars. It was also noted that many of their teachings had close parallels. Buddhism was unquestionably centuries older than Christianity. Was it possible the authors of Christianity copied their ideas from Buddhism? Smile of the Buddha. Long before the word, quote, missionary came to be synonymous with Christianity, Buddhist monks, Dharmabhanakas, were traipsing across Asia. Traveling the silk and spice routes, they spread their doctrines all the way from Khotan in Central Asia to Antioch and Alexandria in the West. One such visit is documented in 20 BC in Athens. A Buddhist philosopher, Zarmaris, part of an embassy from India, made a doctrinal point by setting himself alight. His tomb became a tourist attraction and is mentioned by several historians. Clearly, the evangelists of Buddha were committed to their cause. Is it simply coincidence that the hero of the Buddhist tale is just a tad similar to the Christian Superman? In both the story of the Buddha and the story of Jesus, we read of a mystic or holy man traveling from village to village. Each lives off the hospitality of the people and gets into trouble with the ruling elite by ignoring social status and taking food and refuge from prostitutes. Is it just possible that the miracles ascribed to Jesus merely mimic the tricks practiced by the quote-unquote holy men in India? Contact. Trade between East and West is of great antiquity. Cuneiform tablets as early as 2400 BC describe shipments of cotton cloth, spices, oil, grains, and such exotic items as peacocks from the Indus Valley region to the Middle East. An Oxyrhynchus papyrus fragment from Egypt contains a passage in a South Indian language. The silk and spice routes carried more than trade goods. From the Buddhist heartland on the Ganges, notions of the sacred accompanied the spice and incense. Alexander and Ashoka. Alexander the Great, 336 to 323 BC, carried Greek civilization to the east. Cities along the trade route, Merv, Bactra, Taxila, etc., became Greek military colonies. The Indian province in the northwest, Gandhara, had been a Persian satrap before the arrival of the Greeks, and here, in the 2nd century BC, Greek kingdoms with a distinctive Greco-Bactrian culture emerged. But the flow of culture was two-way. For example, the Greeks adopted the Indian war elephant and a great deal of speculative Indian thinking. Greek philosophers like Anaxarchus and Pyrrho had been in the train of Alexander and had mixed with the Indian gymnosophists, or quote-unquote naked philosophers. Even the more ancient Pythagoreans may have been influenced by Indian ideas. Vegetarianism, communal property, and the, quote, transmigration of souls, unquote. After their conquest of the Indus Valley, the Greeks never again returned to the simple pantheon of their Olympian gods, and founded their first school of skepticism, as per E. Flintoff, Pyrrho and India, Phronesis, Chapter 25, pages 88 through 108. At the time of Alexander, the Magadha Empire had dominated the middle and upper Ganges, but Alexander never got that far. Yet into the vacuum created by Alexander's departure and bringing East and West closer together moved Chandragupta, Sandracotus to the Greeks, founder of the Mauryan Empire. He conquered Magadha and also the Greek kingdoms of the northwest and much of northern India. His empire included the northern province of Kosala, where a Hindu reformer, Gautama Siddhartha, a.k.a. Shakyamuni Buddha, began advocating his quote-unquote middle path between greed and asceticism. Siddhartha's philosophizing had little consequence during his own lifetime, but in 270 BC, the grandson of Chandragupta, Ashoka, ascended the Mauryan throne. Initially a ruthless imperialist, he seems, like Marcus Aurelius, to have spent his later life in soul-searching and pondering the afterlife. In an action that anticipated Constantine's religious revolution 500 years later, Ashoka adopted Buddhism as a unifying and pacifying ideology for his vast empire and propagated its doctrines with all the usual zeal of a new convert. Judging by its still extant edicts inscribed on rocks and stone pillars to be found everywhere from Afghanistan to South India, Ashoka sought further, quote, conquest beyond his frontiers by dispatching Buddhist missionaries in all directions, quote unquote, conquest by Dhamma. Carved in stone, for example, is Ashoka's urging of forgiveness. Quote, the killing, death, or deportation of 100th or even 1,000th part of those who died during the conquest of Kalinga now pains beloved of the gods. Now, beloved of the gods thinks that even those who do wrong should be forgiven, where forgiveness is possible. End quote. By this stage, the Buddha's words of wisdom have been codified into a number of, quote, sutras, or collections of aphorisms, propagated by a growing number of rival sects. Worlds collide. The 3rd century BC empire of Ashoka included a vast area of the Greeks' Eastern Empire established a century earlier. After Alexander, the Seleucids ruled the Greek Empire east of the Euphrates. A century later, they had taken over the kingdom of Antigonus in Syria and Asia Minor, but had lost control of Parthia, Bactria, and the Indus Valley. In quotes, conquest by Dhamma. Quote, now it is the conquest by Dhamma the beloved of the gods considers to be his best conquest. And conquest by Dhamma has been won here on the borders, even 600 yojanos away, where the Greek king Antiochus rules. Beyond there where 4 kings named Ptolemy, Antigonus, Mages, and Alexander rule. Here in the king's domain among the Greeks, the Kambojas, the Nabakas, everywhere people are following beloved of the gods' instructions in Dhamma, even where beloved of the gods' envoys have not been. These people, too, having heard of the practice of Dhamma and the ordinances and instructions in Dhamma given by beloved of the gods, are following it and will continue to do so. This conquest has been won everywhere, and it gives great joy, the joy which only conquest by Dhamma can give. But even this joy is of little consequence. Beloved of the gods considers the great fruit to be experienced in the next world to be more important. I have had this Dhamma edict written so that my sons and great-grandsons consider making conquest by Dhamma only, for that bears fruit in this world and the next. End quote. Ashoka's Rock Edict at Gemuri in Gujarat. Buddhist monks in Egypt. There are records from Alexandria that indicate the arrival of a steady stream of Buddhist monks and philosophers. They would surely have contributed to the philosophical speculations and syncretism for which the city was noted. In particular, it seems the original Therapeutae were sent by Ashoka on an embassy to Pharaoh Ptolemy II in 250 BC. The word Therapeutae is itself of Buddhist origin, being a Hellenization of the Pali, quote, Theraputa, or literally son of the elder. Philo Judaeus, a 1st century AD contemporary of Josephus, described the Therapeutae in his tract De Vita Contemplativa. It appears they were a religious brotherhood without precedent in the Jewish world. Reclusive ascetics devoted to poverty, celibacy, good deeds, and compassion, they were just like Buddhist monks, in fact. From the Therapeutae, it is quite possible a Buddhist influence spread to both the Essenes, a similar monkish order in Palestine, and to the Gnostics, adepts of philosophical speculations. Influence of Buddhism on Gnosticism. Buddhism was a religion of quite a different order to earlier, quote, pagan cults. It was a scriptural religion, making a strong appeal to the emotions. It offered a moral code and hope. The doctrine of incarnation. The Gnostic idea of liberating the soul from entrapment in matter is not dissimilar to the teachings embodied in the quote-unquote 4 Noble Truths of the Buddha. In Buddhism, mankind is seen as trapped in suffering, dukkha, by desire, tanha. Its cessation, nirodha, is to be realized by an 8-fold path of, quote, right thought, right deed, right attitude, end quote, etc., or magga. Rather than salvation, An equally whimsical nirvana is postulated. Nirvana, light. The path of self-liberation, by meditation, asceticism, etc., is demanding and fails to deliver the immediate consolation ordinary people hope for. An easier option, quote-unquote, outer mystery, soon developed within both Gnosticism and Buddhism, by which, quote-unquote, devotion to the God, prayer, chanting, ringing of bells, waving incense sticks about, etc., bestowed liberation, salvation, and nirvana, respectively, to the God's devotees. From Gnosticism emerged the literalists of Christianity, for whom the Saviour was given a real historic presence. From Buddhism, Mahayana, or greater vehicle, Buddhism emerged, in which the real historical Buddha was gradually raised to the status of a divine incarnation, one in a series of enlightened beings. The Lotus Sutra, Saddharma Pundaraka Sutram, emphasizes mere faith in the Buddha as sufficient for salvation, and advises Buddhist missionaries to convert humanity where necessary through symbolic language, codes, parables, etc. And interestingly, both developments occurred towards the end of the 1st century A.D. Where did they get their ideas from? More than 24 story elements borrowed from the Buddha follow. Pre-existence, royal origin and genealogy, virginal conception by mother/virgin birth, dream vision, white elephant/white dove parallel, annunciation to the husband, annunciation of birth by a woman, righteous foster father, marvelous light/star, angels and others at birth, the Magi's visit, giving of gifts, presentation in the temple, infant prodigy/precocious youth, nature miracle, the naming ceremony, the taming of wild animals, the miracles of the bending tree and gushing water, the fall of idols, healing miracles, sage recognition, Asita/Simeon parallel, Anna and Shabari/old woman parallel, the appellation of king, Mary/Mahaprajapati parallel, fast in the wilderness/temptation by the devil, preparing the way, reference to signs, offer of universal salvation. Birth of the Saviour. The conception and birth of Christ in the Gospel of Luke has an uncanny resemblance to the birth stories of Buddha, In both cases, the mother was a paragon of virtue, had a vision, and, without sex, became pregnant with an extraordinary child. Each was delivered while the mother was on a journey, and their births were both announced by angels. After the birth of Buddha, a hermit sage who had heard the celebrations of angels was told by them that the infant would sit on the throne of enlightenment. In the Christian story, the angels appeared and told shepherds that a child was born who was Christ the Lord. Both narratives stress that holy people came to pay homage to the world's Saviour. Lost and found. The homespun, quote, wisdom of Buddha and Christ are all but identical. For example, Jesus, sinner returns to the Father. Younger son leaves home and squanders his inheritance on wild living. Bankrupt and reduced to feeding pigs, he returns home. Delighted father kills the fattened calf for him. Sensible elder brother indignant and angry, but father explains celebration is justified because his brother had been, quote, lost and is found, unquote. Luke 15:11-32. Buddha, sufferer attains nirvana. Young son leaves home for distant lands, father distraught. Years later, looking for work, son does not recognize his now rich father, who does recognize him. He flees. Father secretly hires him as a scavenger. Years later, dying, he tells son of his inheritance. Lotus Sutra. Trial. After a meal, an innocent man, Charudatta, is accused of murdering the courtesan Vasatasena and is brought to trial. The judge, admitting his incompetence to condemn a Brahmin, sends the case over to the king, who condemns the man to be executed and impaled with an inscription on him. Charudatta is then ordered to carry his cross, Sanskrit sulam, to the place of execution. Meantime, the king's brother-in-law, who actually murdered the courtesan, buries her body under a pile of leaves, but she is found by a Buddhist monk who raises her from her quote-unquote deadly swoon. Vasatasena then saves Charudatta from death. Charudatta forgives his accuser, Samsthanaka, and appoints the Buddhist monk as the head of all the Buddhist monasteries in the realm. There is a marriage in the end as well. Charudatta accepts Vasatasena as his second wife. Source: 2nd BC Sanskrit play, Makakatika, aka Little Clay Cart. Passion. In this story of, quote, Gautama, a holy man, unquote, our hero is wrongfully condemned to die on the cross for murdering the courtesan Bhadra. Gautama is impaled on a cross, and his mentor Krishna Dvaipayana visits him and enters into a long dialogue, at the end of which Gautama dies at the place of skulls after engendering 2 offspring, the progenitors of the Ikshvaku dynasty. Similarities are: 1. The death episode begins for Buddha crossing the Ganges at Magadha, from whence he goes on to Kusinagiri for a last meal. The fable of Matthew, 1539, similarly has J.C. aboard ship to the unknown, quote-unquote, coasts of Magdala, from whence he goes on to Jerusalem for a last meal. 2. Both Buddha and JC forecast their own death 3 times. 3. Buddha arrives at Kukutha, JC at Golgotha. 4. Both Buddha and JC twice refuse a drink. 5. Buddha dies between 2 trees, JC between 2 criminals. 6. Both promise their last convert that, quote, "Today you will be in paradise," unquote. 7. Death occurs during, quote, "darkness." 8. A disciple of Buddha, Kasyapas, traveling with 500 monks, encounters an unknown personage from whom he learns of the death of Buddha. Another unnamed disciple disparages the dead Buddha. The fable of Luke has the disciple, Cleopas, encounter an unknown personage on the road to Emmaus. This, quote, unrecognized Jesus disparages the evident lack of faith. In a variation of the story, the 500 Buddhist monks become Paul's 500 brethren, 1 Corinthians 15:6, though Paul renders, quote, Kasyapas as, quote, Cephas. Simon Peter has his own origin in, quote, Sariputra, also in the Buddhist, quote, Gospel. 9. The dead Buddha is burned, and it is the smoke of his corpse which rises, the true, quote, resurrection. From a 2nd/1st century BC play, Sangha Bedavastu, Mahapari Nirvana Sutra. Essenes, Esoteric Buddhists. The Essenes were a monastic order having much in common with contemporary Buddhists. Most lived in austere existence in the desert, where they eschewed the animal sacrifice of the Jerusalem temple priesthood. They were vegetarians. Renouncing all normal enjoyments, they lived without personal property, money, or women. They recruited from newcomers. The Essenes extolled the merits of asceticism, penance, and self-torture. They were, however, interested in the magical arts and the occult sciences. They believed in the pre-existence of the soul and in angels as divine intermediaries or messengers from God. Influence of Buddhism on the Christians. Q. Close, striking parallels exist between early Buddhist texts and what Bible scholars postulate as the, quote, Q material. Q is shorthand for Quell, the German for, quote, source. The earliest translations of Buddhist texts into Greek date back to the time of King Ashoka, 3rd century BC. It seems highly probable that the core of the body of Q material was made up of aphorisms, sayings originally ascribed to the Buddha but later attributed to Jesus. To these sayings were added many stories and micro-scenes to produce what became the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Aphorisms. From the Dhammapada, Buddha's observation, quote, the faults of others are more easily seen than one's own, but seeing one's own failings is difficult, end quote. Compare the Gospel of Thomas 26. You see the mote which is in your brother's eye, but you do not see the beam which is in your own eye. End quote. This subsequently was given a more theatrical flourish when it became Matthew 7:3. Quote, And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? End quote. From the Dhammapada, quote, When a mendicant, though still young, yokes himself to the Buddha's teachings, the world is illuminated like the moon freed of clouds. End quote. Jesus' statement, He who wishes to follow me must know himself and bear my yoke. End quote. The Mulasarvastivada Vinaya begins with a long list of kings. This is combined with a list of the last 7 Buddhas to give 3 periods of quote-unquote 14 generations and a total of 42. An identical format to the Gospel of Matthew. Love. The whole idea that man should care about his brother, that he should accept responsibility for society as a whole, or for needy human beings in particular, clearly precedes Christianity, in Greek thought and in Buddhism. The Buddha's philosophy of compassion, his vision of Dhamma, the eternal law that sustains the cosmos, manifests itself among humanity as the moral law. The Buddha's most celebrated dictum is, quote, Hostility is never conquered by hostility in this world. Hostility is conquered by love. That is the eternal law. End quote. 500 witnesses. Quote, After that, he was seen of above 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain unto this present, but some are fallen asleep. Unquote. 1 Corinthians 15:6. Buddhist tradition states that shortly after the passing away of the Buddha, 500 of his arhats and disciples met in council at Rajagaha for the purpose of recalling to mind the truths they had heard directly from their hero during the 45 years of his teachings. The Coptic biblical text actually identifies the 500 as, quote-unquote, Indian Brahmins. In short, we find opportunity, motive, method, location, and scriptural evidence for a profound and detailed Buddhist influence in Christianity's origins. That it was so cannot be doubted. Third section, Mithraism, first edition of the Universal Religion. Bull Slayer. Eclipsed as it was in later centuries by the faith of Christ, Mithraism, or rather its Romanized form, Sol Invictus, was the first quote-unquote universal religion of the Greco-Roman world. Mithraism anticipated Christianity in all major respects bar one, and enjoyed a reign of at least 5 centuries. It peaked around the year 300 AD when it became the official religion of the empire. At that time, in every town and city, in every military garrison and outpost from Syria to the Scottish frontier, was to be found a Mithraeum, an officiating priests of the cult. Mithraism was the quote-unquote, religion of choice, particularly in the military, who adopted Mithras rather like Latter-day soldiers would adopt St. Michael or St. George. Mithras slew bulls, St. George slew dragons. Mithraism waged and lost a 200-year battle with the upstart religion of Christ, into which much of its ritual and many of its practitioners were subsumed. Fatally, Mithraism had excluded women entirely, causing well-heeled Roman matrons with a pious frame of mind to explore first Judaism and then Christianity. Also, unlike Christianity, it made no special overtures towards the uneducated, downtrodden, and marginal elements of society. It was a religion chosen by emperors, not slaves. Mithras goes to Rome. The cult of Mithras was actually of very ancient lineage, traceable in one form or another through at least 2,000 years. In origin, it was the primordial sun worship, the father of all religion. Iconography showed Mithras in Phrygian cap and cloak, riding his fiery chariot across the sky. But it was also an Eastern religion, reaching the Roman world from India via Persia. Traditional hostility with Persia did not favor Rome adopting a religion of its enemies. This changed, however, in the 60s BC, when Pompey's legions first entered Syria. Mithraism had so well established itself in the Commagene, Armenia, and eastern Anatolia that whole dynasties of kings had called themselves, quote-unquote, Mithridates, or Justice of Mithra. Rome's troops took to the, quote, machismo faith, with its ceremonies of male bonding and triumphed over death, of self-control and resistance to sensuality. Acolytes were required to descend into a pit, which was then covered by boards filled with holes, and the blood of a sacrificial bull above would shower onto them. Thus sanctified, they could reemerge from the pit, quote, reborn in Mithras. This sacrament, the tarobulia, was the Mithraic forerunner of the Christian baptism. Mithras' rock tomb and place of rebirth, the, quote, Petra, was central to each Mithraeum. The rock connection was later reworked into the legend of St. Peter. Legionnaires took the cult with them into Palestine and back to Rome itself. Several hundred Mithraic monuments have been found in Rome. Coarelli, 1979. Adapted for Roman taste, the most popular Romanized form of Mithraism was Sol Invictus, the unconquerable sun, whose rebirth was celebrated as the climax of the midwinter Saturnalia on December 25th. Celsus tells us that in the Mithraic mysteries, the soul moved through 7 heavenly spheres, beginning with the leaden Saturn and ending with the golden sun. Precursor of Christianity. The theology of Mithraism was centered upon the dying/rising Mithra, emerging fully grown from the quote-unquote virgin dawn, or rock. The association of gods with rocks or stones is not surprising. Fiery rocks falling from the sky, meteorites, and even sparks released by colliding stones could equally strike the simple-minded as, quote, evidence of a godly presence. Holy stones were anointed with oil. Mithra was fathered by the creator god Ahura Mazda. Mithra's supposed creation had occurred in a, quote, time before men, unquote, a cosmic creation in a celestial heaven. At no time was it believed that he had lived as a mere mortal and trod the earth. Mithraism's failure to have anthropomorphized its God into a man, something which was to be accomplished so successfully by Christianity, weakened the cult's appeal to the uneducated and opened the door to competition. In all other major respects, the theology of the two cults were all but identical. Mithras had had 12 followers with whom he had shared a last sacramental meal. He had sacrificed himself to redeem mankind. Descending into the underworld, he had conquered death and had risen to life again on the third day. The holy day for this sun god was, of course, Sunday. Christians continued to follow the Jewish Sabbath until the 4th century. His many titles included, quotes each, the truth, the light, and the good shepherd. For those who worshipped him, invoking the name of Mithras healed the sick and worked miracles. Mithras could dispense mercy and grant immortality. To his devotees he offered hope. By drinking his blood and eating his flesh, by proxy from a slain bull, they too could conquer death. On a day of judgment, those already dead would be raised back to life. Popular motifs. All this may surprise modern Christians, but it was very familiar to the Church Fathers. See, for example, Justin, Origen, and Tertullian, who filled their, quote, apologies with dubious rationales as to how Mithraism had anticipated the whole 9 yards of Christianity centuries before the supposed arrival of Jesus. Quote, diabolic mimicry by a prescient Satan, unquote, being the standard explanation. Pagan critics were not slow to point out the truth. Christianity had simply copied the popular motifs of a competitive faith. Quote, the 7 deadly sins, which Christians appropriated both iconographically and geographically in their own views of hell, were a Mithraic formulation which looked back to Zoroastrianism, which gave mystic significance to the number 7. Mithra also gave us the Chi-Rho sign, which Christians appropriated. End quote. Alice Turner, The History of Hell, page 36. Syncretic weakness. Mithras was proclaimed the principal patron of the empire by Aurelian in 274 AD. On December 25th, he dedicated a temple to the sun god in the Campus Martius. Mithraism was adopted by Diocletian in 307 AD and by Julian as late as 362 AD. The cult was driven from the scene over the next 100 years by furious and sustained attacks from Christianity. Who would defend Mithras? Mithraism lacked a professional clergy. It had no hierarchical organization disciplined by common rules. Though popular throughout the empire, the cult's ceremonials had remained heavily dependent upon state patronage and support. When state funding was transferred to the church by Constantine and his successors, Mithraism's fate was sealed. Quote, the Mithraic cult was the most syncretistic of all the cults and religions. This caused it to lose its strength, definiteness, and cohesion. End quote. Antonia Tripolitis, Religions in the Hellenistic Roman Age, page 59. Fatally, during the reign of Emperor Gratian, 367 to 383 AD, its sanctuaries were sacked of their wealth and closed. 30 years later, Theodosius made worship of Mithras punishable by death. The god had fallen, but the imagery and iconography of Mithras were expropriated wholesale by the more comprehensive and favored cult of Christ. Onto Jesus' head fell Mithras' sun disk. Christian bishops assumed his headdress and mitre. Quote, "Today the Vatican stands where the last sacrament of the Phrygian Terabolium was celebrated." End quote. S. Angus, The Mystery of Religions, page 235. Faint echoes of the fallen god were to be heard in later Manichaeism. In the 4th century, ordinary Christians had not yet acquired the abject humility and submissive behavior that would characterize the brethren of later centuries. In church, they sang, danced, and clapped. And when they prayed, it was facing to the east, with hands held wide and with face held up, not down, to greet their sun god. Fourth section, the Church of the Shadows, waiting in the wings. Persecution. Quote, "There is a persecution of unrighteousness, which the impious inflict upon the Church of Christ, and there is a righteous persecution which the Church of Christ inflicts upon the impious. Moreover, she persecutes in the spirit of love, they in the spirit of wrath." End quote. Augustine, letter 185, 417 AD. For several nights in 64 AD, Nero's garden was illuminated by a quote-unquote vast multitude of torched Christians. Well, that's the myth. There is no evidence that the Roman government was even aware of the enthusiasts of Christ, let alone bothered to persecute them. Until the early years of the 2nd century, Roman administrators remained ignorant of the very existence of the Christians. For a generation that followed, they were indifferent to this obscure, quote, Jewish sect and its many different factions. But in time, this indifference gave way to contempt and then irritation. Domitian, 81 to 96, executed his cousin Flavius Clemens and banished his niece Domitilla. The charge was, quote, atheism and, quote, Jewish manners, which has allowed both Jews and Christians to claim them as, quote, martyrs. Given that Domitilla's freedmen subsequently assassinated the emperor, the episode was clearly a matter of palace politics and not a, quote, persecution. Famously, Trajan, 98 to 117, told his governor in Pontus, Pliny the Younger, quote, not to seek out, unquote, Christians nor to act on anonymous charges. Pliny's ignorance of the Christians, other than awareness of their name, is certain evidence that there were no laws directed at the sect. Hadrian, 117 to 138, had to wage a 3-year war with Jewish fanatics and was contemptuous of the Jews and by extension the Christians, but continued Trajan's policy of tolerance. During the time of his successor, Antonius Pius, 138 to 161, the Christians went unmolested, and a quote-unquote local outburst had to be conjured up to explain the claimed martyrdom of the 86-year-old Bishop Polycarp in 155, which is sometimes pushed back to 165 or 177, and the reign of Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180. But all that can be held against Marcus is that in trying desperately to defend the empire against its enemies, he threatened exile to those spreading morbid superstitions. Thus again, quote-unquote local outburst had to be conjured up to explain the lurid tale of quote-unquote 50 martyrs in Lyons, or Gaul, in the year 177. In Rome itself, we have only the claimed trial and martyrdom for Justin Priscus, aka Justin Martyr, in an unknown year. Marcus's objection to the still marginal but growing number of Christians was that they turned the misfortunes of the Roman world to their own advantage, that they directed their energies towards frightened widows and abandoned children, towards the slave and criminal classes. Every defeat in battle, every pestilence and natural calamity was seized upon as evidence of divine censure and retribution. With zeal and anticipation, the Christians predicted further ruin and desolation. Among the feckless peoples of the great cities, the fear of imminent judgment and the threat of eternal torment were spread like a contagion. Only by submission to Christ could the individual hope for salvation. Quote, Babylon would surely fall, and most of humanity would perish. By concerted psychoterrorism, the Christians demoralized a population immeasurably larger than their own diminutive numbers. The dissolute son of Marcus, Commodus, 180 to 192, was unconcerned by the Christians. Perhaps he should have been. One of his concubines, Marcia, a Christian, was complicit in his murder. Unlike his intellectual father, the deranged Commodus entertained a favorable opinion of the Christians and employed several in the imperial court. By stealth and bribery, bishops were creeping into the corridors of power. Not only is there no evidence of persecution throughout the 2nd century, but the various Christian sects, fierce rivals to each other, were acquiring property in ever greater amounts. During the reign of Septimus Severus, 193 to 211, a soldier aristocrat from North Africa, churches became major landowners and adopted the practice of giving annual, quote, presents to provincial governors. With all the rewards of the earth within sight, it should surprise no one that Christian infighting turned ugly. Bloody annals from the Church of Christ. One sort of Christian, Callistus, embezzler, extortionist, friend of emperor's whore, makes pope, dies with transvestite. Sex, corruption, murder. The scandal would spice up any era. But this was the Christian church before it was corrupted by power, as it waited in the wings of pagan Rome. In the late 2nd century, a bright and ambitious presbyter, Hippolytus, was keen to impose his own carefully thought-out ideas on the Christ followers of Rome, a church split into many rival factions. Hippolytus was a Greek-speaking theoretician, schooled under Irenaeus at Lyons and by the Eastern, quote, apologists like Origen. His best-known work is Refutatio Omnium Heresium, or Refutation of All Heresies. His mentor, Irenaeus, had already censored Pope Victor, 189 to 198, for arrogance towards other bishops, and when Hippolytus took up residence in Rome, he viewed the church there with some alarm. Victor was pressing ahead with the Latinization of the Roman Church, and had excommunicated the Greek churches of Asia Minor, ostensibly over the dating of Easter. A Greek faction under, quote, Theodosius the money changer, unquote, had established an independent church in Rome which rejected the idea of the Trinity, at that time being promoted by the ruling faction, preferring the, quote, adoptionist theology of, quote, Jesus was an ordinary man on whom the Spirit descended at baptism, unquote. In 198, Victor died, but much to Hippolytus' disgust, he had hoped for the top job himself. A cleric called Zephyrinus, 198 to 217, took the bishop's chair. Hippolytus, in the first book of his refutation, called the quote-unquote Philosophimena, describes Zephyrinus as a, quote, simple man without education, unquote. In a later work called The Apostolic Tradition, he complained that under Zephyrinus' leadership, church discipline had become lax, the church itself corrupt, and public worship a scandal. Turf War. During Zephyrinus' long tenure, factional rivalry in the city became endemic. A group of soothsayers led by Montanus built a strong following, even among the bishop's own entourage, and a third group, led by Sabellius, rejected the logos and stressed the, quote, modes of a unitary God. Hippolytus attacked them all, and Zephyrinus himself for doing nothing about it. A contemporary churchman, Tertullian in Carthage, equally austere, rallied to Hippolytus' support and censured the bishop in Rome. What really irked Hippolytus was that the new pope relied heavily on the archdeacon Callistus as his enforcer, a rough, tough Roman who had reached the top the hard way. The contempt felt by Hippolytus became all the greater when Zephyrinus' right-hand man Callistus followed him into the top job. The ideologue Hippolytus locked horns with the mobster, asserting a rival claim to be Bishop of Rome, and for several years the two men led rival Christian gangs. Though Hippolytus was in the end to lose out, and in the process became history's first, quote, anti-pope, he took obvious delight in recording for posterity some home truths about his rival. Apparently, as a young man, Callistus had been the trusted slave of a Christian master, a freedman in the imperial household called Carpophorus. In fact, Carpophorus had entrusted Callistus with considerable funds deposited by fellow Christians for the care of widows and orphans. The money, quote, disappeared, and Callistus made a run for it. He was apprehended aboard a ship in the port of Portus. His punishment was time on a pastrinum, a hand mill. Not long after his release, Callistus was arrested again, this time after a brawl in a synagogue where he was trying to extract money from a group of Roman Jews. Dragged before the city prefect Fusianus, he was denounced by Carpophorus and sentenced to a penal colony, the silver mines of Sardinia. But Callistus had by this time friends in high places. He was, it seems, quote, counselor to Bishop Victor and also a friend of a certain Marcia, who happened to be a concubine of Emperor Commodus. Marcia had been, quote, brought up by the presbyter Hyacinthus before being passed on to Commodus. Party time! Thanks to the intercession of Marcia, Callistus was soon released from Sardinia and was sent south by Victor to manage the Antium or Anzio operation on a monthly retainer. With Victor's death and the election of Zephyrinus, Callistus was summoned back to the capital by the new boss to manage a burial ground that the church had acquired. According to the Catholic Encyclopedia, Callistus, quote, obtained great influence over the ignorant, illiterate, and grasping Zephyrinus by bribes, unquote. With the death of Zephyrinus, Callistus moved into the boss's chair. Callistus' own time as Pope, 217 to 222, coincided precisely with the reign of that most exotic of emperors, Elagabalus. The Syrian transvestite Elagabalus, a teenager of 14 when he came to the throne, combined outrageous bisexuality with a religious fanaticism. Emotionally dependent upon his mother, with whom he was sexually involved, he married in quick succession 3 older women, including a Vestal Virgin, and a male charioteer. Like Caligula and Nero before him, Elagabalus caroused for quote-unquote rough trade in the streets of Rome and even solicited quote tricks within the corridors of the Imperial palace. Surrounding himself with a gay court, he gave high office to sexual favorites, among others an actor made commander of the Praetorian Guard, a muleteer appointed imperial tax collector, and a barber. Elagabalus, like Callistus, was a high priest, in his case worshipping a sacred black stone, almost certainly a fallen meteorite, which he brought with him in jewel-encrusted splendor from Emesa in Syria to Rome. But he also believed himself to be that god, the living incarnation of the sun god. He instituted an annual procession across Rome in which Elagabalus the man ran backwards before the chariot carrying Elagabalus the stone. Dressed in silk and often a blonde wig, his bizarre, quote, otherness demonstrated to the populace that he was no mere mortal. Rapacious taxation and wars of conquest were not for Elagabalus. His preoccupation was to convert polytheistic Rome to an enforced monotheism. Callistus shared that goal. In keeping with the spirit of the age, Callistus was also notable for a libertine, quote, open-door policy. Much to the disgust of Hippolytus and the austere Tertullian in Carthage, who wrote a scathing attack, the Pudicitia, Callistus admitted, quote, fornicators and murderers, unquote, into the church, requiring of them only a statement of, quote, contrition. Like Elagabalus, Callistus came to a sudden end. He was, it seems, quote-unquote, killed in a riot. Perhaps this was the same riot in March 222, which followed the assassination of Elagabalus. After the emperor's body had been dragged through the streets, quote, a large number of Elagabalus henchmen subsequently also met with a violent death, unquote. One writer reports that Callistus was murdered by a pagan lynch mob enraged by Christian expansion in the Trastevere district. Duffy, Saints and Sinners, page 14. According to legend, Callistus' body was, quote, thrown into a well, unquote. Hippolytus, as rival pope, continued his attacks on the ruling faction. First Urban I, 222 to 230, and then Pontianus, 230 to 235, until a new emperor, Maximinus Thrax, 235-238, no friend of any Jesus faction, sent Hippolytus and Pontianus to the Sardinian mines, where the old theologian died. Another sort of Christian, Tertullian, hardline Christian, enthusiast for divine retribution. Church Father Tertullian, 160-220, a contemporary of Callistus, was a Christian of another stripe. An austere Puritan rather than a venal careerist, Tertullian spouted fire and brimstone from his base in Carthage. Quote, "You are fond of spectacles. Expect the greatest of all spectacles, the last and eternal judgment of the universe. How shall I admire, how laugh, how rejoice, how exult, when I behold so many proud monarchs and fancied gods, groaning in the lowest abyss of darkness, so many magistrates who persecuted the name of the Lord, liquefying in fiercer fires than they ever kindled against the Christians." Unquote. Tertullian, salivating at the thought of Armageddon. Gibbon, Decline and Fall, Chapter 15. According to the precepts of Tertullian's Christianity, those who died a martyr's death, quote, "the baptism of blood," unquote, went immediately to paradise and there awaited reunion with their bodies at the resurrection of the dead. Tertullian introduced the novel idea that a martyr's day of death was his, quote, "birthday." He also claimed that many of the brethren had won their martyr's crown. Quote, "The Christians are to blame for every public disaster and every misfortune that befalls the people. If the Tiber rises to the walls, if the Nile fails to rise and flood the fields, if the sky withholds its rain, if there is earthquake or famine or plague, straightway the cry arises, 'The Christians to the lions!'" End quote. Bruce, page 180. Should we believe this? Tertullian's invention include Marcus Aurelius honoring Christian soldiers and the Emperor Tiberius being a closet Christian. Gibbon comments drolly how curious it is that the uncompromising fanatic did not himself suffer martyrdom. More disturbing was Tertullian's hostility to secular knowledge, which he dismissed as, quotes each, idle speculation and a useless affection. Quote, "Tell me, what is the sense of this itch for idle speculation with the stupidities of philosophy?" End quote. From De Prescriptione Hereticorum. A severe, uncompromising man, virgins should be veiled, second marriage was fornication, etc. It is not surprising that Tertullian broke with the Catholics in Rome, about 211, both for their lax ways and because of their impure theology. He initially joined the Montanists, who claimed a direct line to the deity and to speak with the voice of the Holy Spirit. Like all true fanatics who alone know the truth, Tertullian eventually established his own sect and gleefully awaited an imminent end time. The end is nigh. The 3rd century became an age of chronic instability for the Roman world. Barbarian tribes on the frontiers posed no greater threat than they had before, but within the fabric of Roman society, religious fanatics, rejecting the values of a cosmopolitan world culture and convinced that only they knew the will of God, challenged the efforts of Rome's most capable emperors to establish consensus and unity. The Christians stood apart, refusing military service and discouraging others. They scorned the state gods and interpreted the misfortunes of the empire as the prophesied prelude to the destruction of, quote, Babylon and the return of their Christ. After the corruption introduced by the Syrian monarchs and the erosion of Roman self-confidence, civic pride and loyalty by the activity of the Christians, first the Praetorian Guard and then the frontier legions intervened repeatedly in the making and breaking of emperors. The empire began to fragment, with separatist regimes arising in Gaul and Syria. After a half-century of chaos, Decius, 250 to 251, a soldier aristocrat from the Balkans, tried desperately to restore stability and unity to the empire and the quote-unquote peace of the gods, Pax Deorum. Decius appointed roving commissioners who required all citizens to honor the traditional state gods by sprinkling incense on a brazier and pouring a libation for the health of the emperor. Loyal subjects received a certificate of compliance, libellus. Christian historians gleefully regard this policy as the, quote, first real persecution, unquote, because some fanatics refused to toast the emperor's health and provoked the state into retaliation. Martyrs recorded are Bishop Fabianus of Rome, Babylos of Antioch, and Alexander of Jerusalem, and a bizarre X-rated martyrdom of Saint Agatha, apparently at the hands of a senator. For just over a year, Rome was without a bishop. The real consequence of Decius's policy, which was not directed specifically at Christians, was to cause division within the ranks of the brethren, isolating the extremists. The, quote, moderate Catholics sought to cozy up to imperial agents. Decius died fighting the Goths, the first emperor to die fighting a foreign army in battle. Decius' successor, Valerian, 253 to 260, an aristocrat from an old Roman senatorial family, had the wisdom to share power with his son Gallienus and to divide their efforts geographically. Decius tackled the crisis in the east, where the Syrian provinces had been lost to the Persians. But disaffection in the Syrian legions was rife, prompting the emperor to issue an edict in 257 requiring all priests to sacrifice to the state gods on pain of exile and sequestration of their property. In desperate need of funds for the war effort, Valerian ordered the seizure of the accumulated wealth of the Christian churches, but encountered such fierce resistance that the following year he called for the summary execution of clergy who refused to sacrifice. Martyrs from this time are said to have included Pope Sixtus II, his deacon Lawrence, and 6 other deacons. Apparently, Lawrence was slowly roasted on a grill and as a result, really became the patron saint for cooks. Legend says he found the strength to tell his executioners, quote, "Turn me over, I am done on this side," end quote. At Carthage, Cyprian, exiled under the first edict, was now recalled and publicly beheaded. As a yardstick of these troubled times, during Cyprian's 12-year reign as bishop, 4 Roman emperors and their families had perished. Quote, "It is remarkable that, of so great a multitude of bishops in the province of Africa, Cyprian was the first who was esteemed worthy to obtain the crown of martyrdom," end quote. Gibbon. Betrayed in the city of Edessa to the Persians, Valerian suffered the ignominy of being captured, used as a footstool by Sapor I, and then being flayed, much to the glee of the Christians. a chastened Gallienus rescinded his father's edicts and made his peace with the church. The so-called, quote-unquote, Peace of Gallienus lasted for half a century and saw the church become a major property and landowner. Quote, the emperors allowed the Christians in their service to make the freedom of the faith almost a matter of glory. End quote. Eusebius of Caesarea. Bishops now made regular appearances at the imperial court. Gallienus himself was assassinated and the empire returned to chaos. The only recourse was a lurch into military despotism and a corporate state. This militarization of the state was reflected in the church itself, which, by the late 3rd century, had purged itself of independent minds and had replaced democratic elements with a disciplined hierarchy. The defeated factions, like mutinous bodies of troops, seceded and continued a resistance. The main body of the church, committed to the, quote, orthodoxy of imperial organization, if not yet the, quote, orthodoxy of doctrine, confronted the Roman state as a, quote-unquote, republic within the republic, with its own treasury, laws, magistrates, and command structure. In the early 4th century, tough soldier emperors attempted to eradicate the public menace, but it was too late. Though the Christians constituted perhaps 5% of the population, they were concentrated in enclaves in the key cities of the East. When the churches were closed, the imperial palace at Nicomedia was twice firebombed. When the zealots were arrested, an ambitious prince in the West made the fanatics of Christ the subject of his patronage and protection. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. In 286, 2 years after becoming emperor, Diocletian promoted his trusted colleague Maximian to the rank of Augustus. 7 years later, he appointed 2 new Caesars, Constantius, given Gaul and Britain in the west, and Galerius, assigned to the Balkans in the east. The intention was to provide an imperial presence in all sectors of the empire and provide for orderly succession. Maximinus Dea, Maximin, based his court at Caesarea and ruled Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor. Though these were among the richest provinces of the empire, they also presented Maximin with the most contentious problem of Jewish and Christian radicals. After the Persian War of 297 and 298, the Caesar Galerius became increasingly concerned with disaffected Jews and fanatical Oriental cults, notably Christian ones. Even his own wife, Diocletian's daughter, had been mixing with the Christ followers. He adopted a policy that soldiers and administrators in his service had to affirm their loyalty by a sacrifice to the old gods. Those who refused were obliged to resign their posts. During the winter of 302-303, Galerius urged upon Diocletian a tougher stance on Christianity. As a result, Diocletian and Maximian met in Rome and jointly issued their infamous laws. In February 303, an edict was promulgated for the destruction of churches and sacred books, the death penalty for secret assembly, and for the punishment of leading Christians by loss of public office and civil rights. An African bishop, Felix, was beheaded for failing to hand over books. This led to a stampede of others who did so, the so-called, quote, traditors. Some martyrs are reported from Spain, but none from Britain. Later in 303, a further edict required the arrest and imprisonment of all Christian clergy who, nonetheless, were to be released after sacrifice to the old gods. In April 304, a final edict required that all Christians, clergy, and laity were to sacrifice on pain of death. But only 1 year later, on 1st of May 305, after a lifetime of service to the empire, the ailing emperor retired and the persecution was halted. With his own abdication, Diocletian compelled his co-Augustus Maximian to do the same. Constantius and Galerius became the new Augusti, and 2 new Caesars were chosen, Severus in the west and Maximinus Daia, nephew of Galerius, in the east. In 306, the orderly management of the empire fell apart. The sickly Constantius died. Severus became Augustus, but the ambitious son of Constantius, Constantine, compelled his acceptance as Caesar from his fortress at Trier. Then another malcontent, Maxentius, the son of Maximianus, proclaimed himself Augustus in Rome. Galerius, the senior monarch, convened a conference at Carnuntum in late 308 to resolve matters. Severus had fallen in battle against Maxentius, and Galerius appointed Licinius, another army colleague, in his stead. But Licinius chose to remain with his troops in the Balkans rather than move against Maxentius in Italy. Thus, in the years immediately before the celebrated quote-unquote Battle of the Milvian Bridge, 5 pagan princes contended for mastery of the Roman world. In the west, Constantine in Gaul, Maxentius in Italy, Licinius in the Balkans, Galerius in Nicomedia, and Maximin in Caesarea. Galerius and Maximin, confronting a quote-unquote Christian problem demoralizing their forces and causing commotion in the cities, adopted a hardline policy towards the obstinate fanatics. An edict issued by Galerius in 308 ordered that all men, with wives, children, and servants, were to offer sacrifice to the gods, quote, and that all provisions in the markets should be sprinkled with sacrificial wine, unquote. Surely the cruelest of persecutions. Licinius backpedaled on the official policy. In the West, where factions of the Church in Rome and Carthage were themselves in conflict, Maxentius adopted a policy of toleration, hoping for Christian support for his rebellion. Constantine, in pagan Gaul, where no Christian problem existed, not to be outflanked, proclaimed himself, quote-unquote, protector of the Christians. And then, in April 311, Galerius died. Shortly before his death, he issued an edict of toleration. Quote, we have been especially anxious that even the Christians, who have abandoned the religion of their ancestors, should return to reason, end quote. Licinius and Maximum divided the east along the Bosphorus, with Maximum taking possession of the heart of the empire. His emissary sought an alliance with Maxentius in Italy. The following year, Constantine made his move and trounced Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge. Now 3 princes wrestled for supremacy. At this late hour, Maximin tried to defeat his Christian adversaries in the great eastern cities by hastily organizing the disparate pagan priesthoods into a hierarchy to match the Christians. Pontiffs and metropolitan high priests, chosen from noble families, were granted the powers of magistrates to enforce the edicts on sacrifice. Temples were restored and invigorated ceremonials introduced. Quote, the zeal and rapid progress of the Christians awakened the polytheists from their supine indifference in the cause of those deities whom custom and education had taught them to revere. End quote. Gibbon. Meanwhile, the wily Constantine forged an alliance with Licinius to divide the world. Meeting at Mediolanum, Constantine married his sister to his erstwhile rival, and together they promulgated the so-called quote-unquote Edict of Milan, granting Christians and others freedom of religion. It was a policy designed to cause Maximin the greatest difficulty. Enraged, he force-marched his troops across Asia Minor in the depths of winter to take Byzantium by siege. Licinius' counterstroke with fresh troops routed Maximin's exhausted troops, and he fled back to Tarsus. He took ill and died, to the jubilation of the Christian bishops. Quote, "The defeat of Maximin soon delivered the Church from the last and most implacable of her enemies." End quote. Gibbon. Licinius' triumph was short-lived. Having eliminated Constantine's most formidable enemy, Constantine returned the favor by destroying Licinius' army and executing his now unloved brother-in-law. Thus did an eminently qualified, quote, Christian monarch emerge as master of the world. Organized Christian fanatics had aided Constantine's coup. In return, they were empowered as propagandists for the Christian monarchy and were rewarded with confiscated temple treasures throughout the empire. 4th century bishops were well-heeled, well-connected, and lived in grand houses next to the main church at the state's expense. The career opportunities were breathtaking. Quote, Imperial patronage colossally increased the wealth and status of the churches. Privileges and exemptions granted to Christian clergy precipitated a stampede into the priesthood. Devout aristocratic ladies acquired followings of clerical groupies and experimented with fashionable forms of devotion. End quote. Fletcher, The Conversion of Europe, page 38. A triumphant state church, lording over a disbelieving and reluctant congregation, began the process of gathering in its flock and fabricating a glorious past, the better to bring foolish pagans to the true faith. Every bone became a martyr, and every martyr a legend of heroic death. Evangelicals. Quote, wherever we look, bishops were encouraging the landed elites to take firm and coercive action to make the peasantry Christian. Like it or not, this is what our sources tell us over and over again. Demonstrations of the power of the Christian God meant conversion. Miracles, wonders, exorcisms, temple torching, and shrine smashing were themselves acts of evangelization. End quote. Fletcher, The Conversion of Europe, page 45. With the triumph of Constantine, the inmates came into possession of the asylum. Their insanities were to become the only acceptable world view. Demonic nonsense, dreamed up in the psychotic mind of the pious theologian, populated the natural world with monstrous phantoms and set Satan's familiars at every cherished spring and venerable grove. Ever more lurid descriptions of hell instilled dread and terror. Every town and hamlet was polluted by limitless malevolence, from which the only deliverance was complete submission to Holy Mother Church and her rapacious agents. Constantine placed himself at the head of the collective Christian fraternities, rewarded their bishops, and obtained their fawning adoration. Fanaticism was now pressed into service as the propaganda of a divine monarch. zealotry was directed not merely at the pagan and the skeptic, but also at the brethren who had failed to understand the true nature of the political revolution, had failed to adapt to servitude in the kingdom of the world, and still cast their eyes wistfully on an anticipated kingdom of heaven. Christian monarchs would far surpass in resolution and cruelty the mild attempts of the pagan Caesars to eliminate such unacceptable thoughts. Quote, from the history of Eusebius, it may, however, be collected that only 9 bishops were punished with death, and we are assured by his particular enumeration of the martyrs of Palestine that no more than 92 Christians were entitled to that honorable appellation. Palestine may be considered as the 16th part of the Eastern Empire. It is reasonable to believe that the country which gave birth to Christianity produced at least a 16th part of the martyrs who suffered death within the dominions of Galerius and Maximin. The whole might consequently amount to about 1,500, an annual consumption of 150 martyrs. End quote. Gibbon, Decline and Fall, Chapter 16. Gibbon calculated 1,500 Christian martyrs for the whole climatic decade of persecution in the more populous East. The western provinces were little affected, and such persecutions as occurred were of brief duration. In total, then, the pagan assault on the Christians throughout a 300-year period claimed, quote, somewhat less than 2,000 persons, end quote. The Roman assault upon the partisans of Christ might be set against any number of later atrocities. Victims of the witch trials, burnings and lynchings during the period of 1300 to 1800 are conservatively put at 35 to 65,000, and many estimates are much higher. Victims of the Inquisition, though sometimes speculatively put in the millions, in any event far exceeded anything dreamed of by the cruelest of Roman emperors.